Former CIA Director John Brennan, our senior national security and intel analyst. Also with us, MS Now senior investigative reporter Carol Leonnig and law professor at Hofstra University, James Sample. It is good to see you all. Carol, what do we know about the investigation or investigations into Newsom and his wife?
Thanks, Alicia. What we learned last night and yesterday afternoon was that, indeed, there have been ongoing investigations of Gavin Newsom, some of his staff, and also of his wife that really began in got moving more quickly, let's say, in early 2025. The investigation that centers on Newsom's wife, Jennifer Seibel Newsom, is focusing on evidence suggesting tax fraud or tax evasion. And I caution everyone who's listening, we don't have that evidence in front of us. We don't know the seriousness of that information, but we know from very good, reliable sources that that's the center of the probe. And we don't know exactly when these series of investigations, all emanating out of California, with some participation in some cases by the Justice Department in Main Justice in the headquarters. We don't know exactly when they began to turn in earnest to Gavin Newsom's wife, but we're told it's been going on for months in terms of interviews of people around her. I want to say one more thing, Alicia, if you don't mind giving me this little bit of time, which is to say there are individuals who believe that this investigation is quite serious, and they are sources I rely upon who are not Trump allies or whisperers or enablers, who believe this is a pretty significant case. I say that because it's important to know that everybody has serious doubts about the Department of Justice under Donald Trump and whether or not its goals are first to pick the targets and then look for the crimes, or actually if evidence naturally developed that suggested some wrongdoing in her tax filings and her use of a nonprofit, or whether she was chosen essentially ahead of time as someone to target because of her relationship to a Democrat who is likely going to be running for president in the next cycle.
Right. And that not knowing, James, that is part of the moment that we find ourselves in. It is part of the damage that has been done by this administration, the lack of faith in institutions. I think it is interesting the way that Governor Newsom and his team have chosen to hit back this request under FOIA for information, every mention of him, of his wife in the last few months. What could that tell us? Not just for Newsom himself, but about the inner workings of the department?
I think it could tell us a lot. And to take Carol's point very, very seriously, there may be a serious investigation here. But by submitting this FOIA request, which Governor Newsom did yesterday, that starts a 20-day clock. And the express FOIA request that he made is for every communication from the Department of Justice, from Todd Blanche, from Pam Bondi on down, referencing Governor Newsom and referencing his wife since January 20, 2025. That means that we will learn first from that FOIA request how much, if any, of this was essentially predicated and pressured from the top down, or how much of it was driven from California as a local point specifically. That will be the guide that tells us first whether or not this was looking for the individual and then finding evidence to retrofit, or looking for finding evidence and then pursuing an investigation. The sequencing here will be revealed, at least as much as sequencing can be revealed at an early stage, by the FOIA request rather than by litigation.
I understand the point that you're making, James, about the sequencing, but I'm also curious, Carlos, you speak to your sources. Is the sense that the California office is less political than DOJ itself?
Great question, and you just gave me a wonderful platform to kind of address some of the smart things James was saying as well. Let me be clear about two important pieces of context here. We know, for example, and I reported yesterday, but we didn't talk about it yet, that the Central District of California, which is run right now by an acting first assistant named Bill Asaly, that prosecutor, that top prosecutor who's an ardent Trump ally, has been pressing his line prosecutors to, quote unquote, get him a case on Newsom. And that has been very disturbing to those prosecutors, according to my sources. Different in this instance about Gavin Newsom's wife, this case is being led by the Eastern District of California rather than the Central. The Eastern District, which is based in Sacramento, the state capital. And my sources have said over and over again, this case involved the public integrity section at Main Justice and also the Sacramento prosecutors, because you need local prosecutors involved. And so there's a piece of both of the headquarters and the field office, if you will, in this case. I think what's probably going to be the most important in vetting whether or not this was a case in which we're looking for the crime involving the target, again, will be the timeline. When did Penn discover, when did Main Justice and the Public Integrity Section join in this case? And when was there a conclusion, both by the field office and by headquarters, that there was some concrete evidence of some sort of tax fraud here? And again, involving Jennifer Seibel Newsom's nonprofit and possibly her personal use of some of those funds. That's what's alleged here.
Director Brennan, like you, California Democratic Senator Adam Schiff, also a target of the administration. Here was Schiff's reaction to the Newsom probe.
This willingness to go after the president's enemies, and Gavin is just the latest on the enemies list, is part of what has just destroyed any semblance of the rule of law in that department. I think people are growing numb to this extraordinary abuse of the Justice Department. I think the presumption is now completely flipped from the presumption the public used to have about when somebody was under investigation. Well, there must be something there or they wouldn't do it. Now I think the presumption has to be, particularly when the president is targeting someone, this is bad faith until it's proven otherwise.
Director Brennan, what is the damage that is done to the institution, to individuals, to our democracy when that presumption of innocence is flipped on its head?
Well, Alicia, as everyone knows by now, the reputation of the Department of Justice under Donald Trump has been so tarnished that it really undermines and undercuts any confidence that these cases that are being pursued, whether or not there's somebody who is a critic of Donald Trump or not, has any legitimacy and basis in evidence, because it is being used as a retributive arm of the Trump administration. And so it's clear that Donald Trump has been determined to use the Department of Justice. And unfortunately, Todd Blanche and others within the Department of Justice are, as Carol said, are they looking for the crime as they target individuals? And again, undermining that confidence that the American people should have that the Department of Justice is really going to try to protect American citizens from injustice. But it's turned it on its head because Donald Trump, again, has been determined to use the tremendous investigative authorities, the prosecutorial authorities of the Department of Justice to go after individuals. And it is quite coincidental that so many of us who have been public critics of Donald Trump and his policies are in the crosshairs of the Department of Justice.
Someone very smart said to me, James, we talk a lot about institutions, and perhaps we need to begin moving this conversation to one about rights and individual rights, that the institutions, there were already people who did not have faith in these institutions. That is part of what gave rise to Donald Trump itself. But people still believe that their individual rights were going to be preserved. And I think part of what we're seeing here, at least what is in question, is whether or not that is still the case.
I certainly hope it's still the case, and I think that if it is still the case, and we have some evidence to say it is still the case, one of the reasons why it's still the case is, paradoxically, that some of our institutions are holding. And I would point there to grand juries and juries, and particularly in the instances where the Department of Justice has pursued cases that, I'll just say, use the word, are completely frivolous. When you talk about an 86-47 Seychelles case, when you go after Mark Kelly and the other Democratic lawmakers for saying you don't have to follow unlawful orders, when you go after all the Bill Pulte mortgage fraud allegations, those cases are being rejected because people who individuals acting on juries are serving as a check on the excesses of the executive department. And that, I think, is an institution composed of individuals protecting individual rights.